For anyone who might be new to LCOC, my name's Asia and I'm the president. And around a year ago, a group of 6 of us, all classicists of colour, came together to create the society with 3 main goals. Firstly, to support the movement to decolonise within the discipline. Secondly, to educate people between the connection between classics and race and the need to decolonise. And finally, to create a network across UOL, primarily for students of colour. We run entirely on donations, so if you enjoy the talk today, please consider donating via one of the links which we posted in the chat. Before I hand over to our secretary, Will, I'd just like to reiterate our zero tolerance policy. Here in the society, we are totally committed to creating a safe and welcoming space for every single member, and therefore we will never tolerate any comments that does not contribute to the well-being of our communal space. So yeah, thank you everyone for listening, and I'm going to hand it over to Will.
Thank you, Asia. Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Today we are hosting the wonderful Dr. Krešimir Vuković for a talk on Indo-European comparative mythology. We're going to be dealing with mythology and decolonization, and we're going to do a little bit of Roman Lupercalia stuff as well. Just a bit of information on the talk. There will be a question and answer section at the end. If you do have any questions, and I really hope you do, because it's going to be interesting stuff, please leave them in the chat. Me and Asia will read them out at the end. Hopefully you all have a good time, and I will now hand over to Krešimir.
Thank you very much, Will, and thank you all for the opportunity to contribute to this wonderful initiative. So can you now see my presentation?
Yeah, all good.
Great. Okay, so as you've heard, this is going to be a bit of a mixed bag of topics, including Indo-European studies, with a specific focus on mythology, the history of scholarship in mythology, and on decolonization, which I think is a necessary step forward in this area. Okay, I'm now trying to move this slide, but it won't move. Okay. So to first introduce you to the basics of the concept of Indo-European, the Indo-European hypothesis is based on linguistic science, which essentially relies on the realization that many languages of Europe and Asia, such as the ancient languages that we study, like Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Persian, have a common origin. That in itself is indisputable. We'll get to the things that are disputable very soon. The first to propose this thesis were actually Jesuit scholars in the 17th century, so Johann Elickmann and Marcus Cerius von Boxholm. This was unfortunately forgotten as the British Empire grew. The realization was, you could say, resurfaced, came again, was rediscovered by one William Jones, who was a British judge in colonial Calcutta. And he actually was very enthusiastic about Sanskrit. So he learned Sanskrit as he was in Calcutta. And he praised the virtues of Sanskrit in his address to the Asiatic Society in 1786. And he pointed out that this actually means that India, as a British colony, actually has history that is far older than Britain, and even older probably than Greece and Rome. Of course, this wasn't embraced by everyone. Not everyone agreed with him, but he pointed, for example, to some obvious parallels between Sanskrit and Latin vocabulary that you can see here. So these words clearly share a common origin. We can exclude, because of the huge number of examples, we can exclude the possibility of borrowing or just random accidental occurrence. Then when you look at the other linguistic evidence, actually, you also see similarities in grammatical structures. So for example, conjugation. If you did things like Greek verbs, you can see here the very basic Latin and Greek conjugation. Its endings pretty closely match those of Sanskrit. So actually, when it comes to the linguistics, the thesis works out. William Jones himself did not invent the term Indo-European. He did not know exactly what to call this language that would be sort of the common ancestor of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and Persian. It was actually coined by an Egyptologist called Thomas Young in 1813. And you can immediately notice the colonial discourse and the colonial sort of bias of this concept, which is trying to unite Indian with European in a kind of false sense of unity. So it's kind of just connecting the British colony at the time where the sort of discovery was made with a general sense of European, because they still didn't know how many languages of Europe would also fall into this category. Unfortunately, no better term has been proposed, despite a whole plethora of suggestions, including Indo-Germanic, which is still unfortunately used in Germany, something that I think is obviously an inapt term. Then Tocharo-Celtic, these kind of very awkward coinages that are trying to connect the furthest reaches of the Indo-European linguistic scope across the world. And then, of course, area. And I'll immediately get to the racial connotations of that. So given that we're talking about the 19th century, the linguistic aspect soon became conflated with nationalistic ideas and identities. The prevailing modes of thought included one, Romanticism. And in Romanticism, language plays a great role. Language was believed to be an expression of the spirit of the people, which is in German called Volksgeist. So it's closely tied to national identity, which was obviously used, for example, by Germans to say that all Germans that speak German should unite in one country because the language is an expression of their identity. Unfortunately, this then got projected onto prehistory. And essentially what happened is the spirit of the people was believed to be also in this Indo-European, if you will say, mother tongue. So the language that was the origin of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and many other languages. And it was generally assumed that the Indo-Europeans, whoever these people were, wherever they came from, and they had very little idea about any of these things, belonged, of course, to the white European race, which was also at the time called Caucasian, Nordic, and Aryan. Now, you don't need to jump immediately onto fascist and Nazi associations, which came later. These various terms became synonym because, of course, the people who were thinking about the Indo-Europeans were mostly white male European scholars. And they simply projected themselves and their kind of idea of an ideal onto ancient history and onto the Indo-Europeans. It was later that a particular strand of this thought, as we shall see, became associated with the Aryan race, which then also in another step with the Nazis became separate from the Jewish and the Semitic languages. So actually in most of the 19th century, people using these terms are still including Semitic languages, people who speak Semitic languages, including Jews. Okay. This is a sort of map of the possible current opinions on where the Indo-Europeans would have come from, which is based both on linguistics and archaeology. So you can see here essentially in southern Russia, eastern Ukraine, is the kind of center from which these migrants all the way back in the 4th millennium BC would have come into Europe and towards Asia, so the area that is now Central Asia, South Asia, and so on. If you look at the situation now, So with the spread of languages, that's just to give you an idea of where the linguistic science stands on this. Indo-European languages include Slavic, Germanic, Romance languages, Indo-Aryan, so-called, that is to say, Indian and Iranian languages, and this covers a lot of Europe and Asia. Another thing that obviously also happened in the 19th century was thinking about how these people got anywhere. So if we have a kind of mother language and we have a people that supposedly spoke this language, how did they get to Europe? How did they get to Asia? How did they get to India? And the kind of obvious model that they immediately reached for was invasion. So essentially, because the British Empire, the French Empire, the German Empire were invading various parts of the world, creating colonies, they projected this too onto the Indo-Europeans and claimed that the original Indo-Europeans also invaded Europe and Asia, which is obviously a more than dubious and controversial construct. So what do we do about this? First of all, decolonization. One way to define decolonization, I think, is as the process of decentering the Eurocentric bias of traditional scholarship in favor of a balanced discussion that treats everyone equally. One of the things that we can see already from this Indo-European discourse, and that, for example, Theresa Forer, amongst many other scholars, has pointed out, that the classics today inherits a lot of that imperialist baggage. Still in classics today, and in the European studies as well, distinct national traditions dominate, as does the traditional Western European embedding of the subject. So at this point, you may ask, well, what is this white guy with a strange name telling me about this topic? And what exactly does this have to do with my own identity? To which I would reply that, of course, this Western, the grand construct of a Western European identity, civilization, and narrative that supposedly goes back to the Indo-Europeans and to Greece and Rome, is opposed to a whole range of different things, racial, national, and many others, including the concept of East Europe. And of course, where I come from is East Europe. So my particular sentiment on this was, I think, best expressed by Ivan Meštrović, a sculptor who actually made these sculptures that you can see here in the picture. And he said, I and my people, being considered barbarians and an inferior race, feel a certain distrust of European culture. And he was, of course, referring to the construction of this Western European culture that came through various ideas of classicism and classicizing also in his area, which is, of course, in art and sculpture. So imperialism is still inherent in classics, not least in the selection of a privileged set of texts, the so-called Western canon, which I think is something that we need to be moving away from. The imperialist heritage and its representatives must be thoroughly analyzed in order to reassess their impact and open the subject to a variety of different voices. And I think that would be a kind of broader and more inclusive vision that I would call global classics. So what I'm going to do in the next part of the talk is I'm going to briefly, not thoroughly analyzed, obviously, because we don't have the time, but I'm going to briefly give you an overview of the main kind of figures that created this kind of imperialist discourse in Indo-European studies. And I'm going to explain the ways in which they erred. And then in the last part of the talk, I'm going to argue that Indo-European studies itself does not necessarily have to die in a kind of broader vision of global classics. In fact, I think it can, if it's a decolonized version of Indo-European studies, offer yet a potential avenue towards a more inclusive vision of classics beyond imperialism. Okay, so the first figure that obviously needs discussing in this context is one Friedrich Max Müller, who was a German born in 1823, studied Sanskrit in Berlin and Paris, and came up to Oxford as a young man to pursue his interest in India. So he was another figure that was really interested in Indian history and language. But as you can already see, the big problem is in the fact in this sentence that he doesn't go to India to pursue his interest. He goes up to Oxford because he thinks that he's going to be able to learn from the British, because India is actually at this point a British colony. Widely considered the founder of comparative mythology, Max Müller presided over a huge range of works and translations that included the Vedas, the oldest poetry of India, to which we'll come to in a moment. In his first talk at Oxford, Müller justified the colonizing mission of the British with reference to the Aryan invasion in prehistory. So this is the Aryan invasion that I already mentioned. Müller was one of the people who were most responsible for taking this term Aryan, which only appears in Iranian and South Asian languages, and making it a synonym for Indo-European in general. And he said the British in India are like the ancient and white, of course, Aryan conquerors of a Black native population, rightly returned to accomplish the glorious work of civilization which had been left unfinished by their Aryan brethren. So notice this projection here of the British onto an ancient, supposedly Aryan, that is to say, in the European population, that is coming as an invader, because the British, of course, are coming as invaders. And of course, they're not coming to conquer and take your resources, they're coming to accomplish the glorious work of civilization, which was somehow left unfinished by these perfect Aryans back in prehistory. So you can see here the kinds of problems that this approach immediately creates. Müller was the first to hold the chair of comparative philology at the University of Oxford, and he became extremely popular in Victorian Britain, so much so that he dined with the royals at Windsor and was a member of their Privy Council even. So just to give you one example of Müller's approach, his mythology is largely called solar mythology because he focuses on the sun and other natural phenomena. He said that mythology was a disease of language, a kind of byproduct of the way people tend to talk about nature. So if you take something like sun, dawn, moon, sky, and so on, they, according to Müller, essentially get a life of their own. So for example, you say the sun rises, the sun sets. So you're basically personifying something that's not really a living human entity, and you're giving it human qualities. And essentially through your imagination, you're making it a human character. And then, of course, in mythology, he found various examples of this. So the sun, for example, in Vedic mythology and Greek mythology, has children, a wife, dawn, etc., which by itself so far isn't that problematic. And actually, there's a lot of evidence that lots of mythologies have solar figures of this sort. The trouble is, Müller posited a kind of evolutionary schema of religious development, where he put Christianity on top and polytheism, so the polytheism that he found in the Greek and Roman sources of the Vedas, were a kind of degenerate version of an original monotheism. So essentially, he was positing a kind of pyramid in which Christianity came on top and everything else was below. It was inferior. It was a degenerate version of an original Christian monotheism, which is actually the opposite of what he found in the ancient sources. Eventually, Müller's approach fell out of fashion. It was called a very obscure talk about the weather, in words of one commentator, which may partly explain why it was so popular in England, because of course, that's where one tends to talk a lot about the weather. So this is just one artistic portrayal of the kind of figure that Müller was talking about. So the humanized, anthropomorphized figure of Sun as a character that's riding a chariot with white horses. The next figure that's really influential in this debate is one James George Frazer, probably the most influential figure in comparative mythology of the first half of the 20th century, left a huge influence on a range of scholars, but also in literature. In his most famous book, The Golden Bough, he makes extensive comparisons of all available religions of the world. And his method is slightly different. He's saying that Greek and Roman religions are on the same level as the primitive religions of the natives. And the natives, of course, were the various peoples under the boot of the British Empire at the time. The most famous example of this was the murder of the sacred king at Diana's shrine near Lake Nemi, which is attested in the Roman sources, including Virgil famously. So basically you had this guy who was a king, a sacred king, in this kind of enclosure in the woods near Nemi. And he was killed by his successor. So if you had to, the guy who wanted to inherit the function needed to kill the previous person. And Frazer explained this with reference to customs of Zulu chiefs, so people in South Africa, saying that they murdered their own chiefs as they got older, which is obviously not true and has never actually been confirmed. But this is just to give you an example of his kind of methodology and way of thinking. Frazer additionally applied Christian terms randomly to various native religions and indiscriminately appended the terms savages and primitives to all sorts of peoples that he did not study directly because he was a kind of armchair anthropologist / classicist who was writing about these things using other people's work. The next influential figure that I think one has to look at is definitely Georges Dumézil. This was a French scholar who was working throughout most of the 20th century. Initially, Dumézil follows Frazer in finding parallels for ancient rituals in various parts of the modern world. However, inspired by the teachings of his mentor Antoine Meillet, he abandons the Frazerian method and turns to texts in Indo-European languages. So he narrows down again the scope of comparison to Indo-European languages and the peoples who spoke them. And eventually he comes to also reject the purely linguistic approach in favor of something that he called structural comparison. And I'm going to get to that in a moment. His most significant discovery was the range of similarities between the Roman priest of Jupiter and the Vedic Brahmin. His first explanation for this was both fanciful and political. Essentially, Brahmin, who is a kind of religious official, you could say a kind of priest in the Vedas, he explained as a Frazerian scapegoat, so as someone who had to be sacrificed as a scapegoat to save the life of the king. Immediately, you see here political implications. Georges Dumézil belonged to a French party that still exists in France and is represented at the University of Sorbonne, royalists. So people who wanted to go back to a time before the French Revolution and restore monarchy in France. It's a kind of right-wing party that's basically wanting to restore kingship. Additionally, his theory of the three functions, so a kind of division of society into priests, warriors, and the rest, which he argued existed already in prehistory, Indo-European prehistory, suspiciously resembles the three social classes of the Ancien Régime, so basically of the French society before the Revolution. So what about that example? The example is essentially here, and it's going to get us to our next bit in the discussion, which is the Lupercalia, What you can see here is 3 columns. Obviously, in the first column, you have the taboos or the prohibitions that apply to the Brahmin. So the kind of priestly class in Vedic society, in late Vedic society. So, for example, the Brahmin must not have anything to do with dogs or goats. He must never be stark naked. He should stop religious activity near the army. He can't be on horseback, on some other conveyance, and so on. This closely resembles to the structure of prohibitions that apply to the Roman figure of Flamen Dialis, who is essentially a priest of Jupiter. And I think you would have to be particularly obstinate to deny that this actually is too good to be true. So it's unlikely to be borrowing across the vast instances that were between ancient India and Rome. It's unlikely to be accidental because you've got a whole set of 9 particular instances that are specific and resemble each other a lot. And you got then the Luperci, and who you may ask are the Luperci? Well, they're also priests in Roman religion, but what they do is exactly the opposite of what the Brahmin and the Flamen must never do. So they sacrifice a dog and a goat. They run around naked. They come from the equestrian order, so they have to do with horses. They drink wine at the festival, they smear themselves with oil, and so on. So when it comes to the Dumézil structural comparison, this shows that he was onto something, despite the fact that he was heavily tainted by his own political beliefs. So what is the Lupercalia? Anyway, you may have encountered this festival already in your various courses, if you're doing classics or classical studies. The Lupercalia is one of the most important and discussed Roman festivals. It's linked to the foundation of the city, to Romulus and Remus. It happens on 15 February every year, when young naked men run around the Palatine Hill and whip women with goatskin whips. The festival and its interpretation already puzzled the ancients. Cicero, for example, called it a relic of primitive times, established before civilization and laws. Its most obvious function is as a rite of passage for the equestrian elite. So basically, men in this rite of passage identified with the animal predators such as wolves, which is actually very widespread across the world. You can find this in many male rites of passage in native traditions up to this day. The nudity that you can see on these representations of the Lupercalia that come already from the ancient world makes them closer to animality. So obviously humans wear clothes, animals don't. So nudity, I would say, has to do with the fact that it's a wolf festival, if you will. What I think is going on here is a kind of analogy. So Romulus and Remus play wolves in the foundation myth of Rome. So as teenagers, they go on these hunting expeditions, cattle rustling and raiding. And that is, in the ancient sources, closely connected to the festival of the Lupercalia. And I think this connection is strong and has to do with the fact that the central part of the Lupercalia was a so-called blood rite, in which the young men would take the blood of the sacrificed victims and apply them to their faces, which is still a widespread hunting initiation rituals in various parts of the world. So my question at this point is, could the foundation myth be inspired by wolf cultures in more ways than one? If you stop for a moment and don't think of the wolf as a big bad wolf or fairy tale, if you actually take wolves seriously as the people who are arguing that we should be using terms like animal cultures, wolves tend to lead intense social lives. They live and hunt in packs. wolf packs is a potent analogy for groups of marauding men, which also comes across in the Greek and Roman sources. The association between Romulus and Remus and wolves is a result, I think, of a fluid boundary between human and non-human animals in early cultures. So today we tend to think of humans on the one hand, animals on the other. I think there is a lot of evidence that in early cultures, this boundary was fluid and porous, that actually you could have hybrids like the god Faunus, who was the god of the Lupercalia, that exhibits both animal and human traits. And you could have cases like the Lupercalia in which humans are drawing on the animal world, are actually wanting to make themselves like animals, and in which the Luperci and the founding twins of Rome are analogous to wolves. Okay, so what does this have to do with decolonization and Indo-European studies? Well, if you look at the oldest sources in Sanskrit, which is called the Vedas, which are actually extremely old, older than Homer and Hesiod, there you find lots of potent analogies for sovereignty. Essentially, the sovereign or the king had to associate with non-human animals in order to get his power. Agni, the fire god, who is represented here on the left, is analogous to the sun, fire in the sky, and appears in the form of a solar bird or horse. So the animals actually are themselves associated with the sun, which is the king in the sky, if you will. And the king, through these various ceremonies, needs to associate himself with the power of the sun, and depends on that on animals such as the horse. So his inauguration is essentially facilitated by way of chariot races and an identification with the horse, which is sacrificed in the royal ritual of Ashwamedha. So essentially, Vedic rituals of sovereignty or royal initiation are based on analogies that connect the human and non-human animals. How does this process work? There's actually a quote from a Shatapatha Brahmana, which is also a part of the Vedic corpus, that I think most clearly shows us the mechanism as the ancients might have seen it. And it says there are wolf hairs. So in the ritual, wolf hairs are used, and various hairs from various animals. Thus he gains the strength and speed of wild beasts. There are tiger hairs, thus he is the king, of course, gains the rage and sovereignty of wild beasts. There are lion hairs, thus he gains the might and lordship of wild beasts. So each animal signifies particular qualities that are needed to create this sense of royal inauguration, to get the king to become the king and so obtain royal power. In this Vedic way of thinking, wolves signify strength, cooperation, and unity, pretty much like they do in ancient Rome. So you could say that in the ritual, the Luperci, these naked men going through the initiation ritual, are wolves of Rome, and the ritual evokes the adventures of Romulus and Remus in their teens, which are again the twins playing wolves in the forest. So I think one way to let the Indo-European studies become a more inclusive and decolonized way to go forward in our study of a whole variety of ancient sources is to use comparison to extend the process of decentering to non-human animals. In other words, to make our topics of study more inclusive by including animals in our consideration of ancient cultures. So to conclude, I would say that one thing that's needed is a specific project to address Indo-European studies all its imperialist aspects that are still affecting the discipline nowadays, and its relationship to race from a post-colonial perspective. So in addition to the scholars that I analyzed, we would also need to consider people like Mahatma Gandhi, like Webb Dubois, and various other people who actually also thought about Indo-European studies and Indo-Europeans, but from a different perspective. Having analyzed people like Max Müller, Georges Dumézil, and James Frazer, I don't think we should simply throw out the baby with the bathwater. So I think that they have committed a lot of mistakes in the way they analyze the ancient sources, as I have shown, and there's a lot of imperialist and racist aspects to their work. But I think in the European studies, which is based on linguistic parallels primarily, should not necessarily disappear as a discipline because these sorts of people were involved in the process of creating it. And I think we should rethink the Indo-European hypothesis itself. So in fact, what science is coming to realize now, including genetic studies, is that Indo-European speakers were immigrants. Actually, the old invasion hypothesis does not explain as much as it was thought to do. If you think of the Indo-Europeans as immigrants that came to Europe from the East and South Asia from the West, that is quite a different image to the conquering hordes of noble supposed Aryans that were the proto-whites in the vision of people like Max Müller and so on. So again, coming back to this map, I don't think anything would be solved by us simply projecting ourselves onto the past, but there is a lot of linguistic and archaeological and genetic evidence that actually various peoples who spoke various languages came from the area of South Russia, that is to say, the Pontic-Caspian steppes at some point in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC, and spread around Europe and spread around lots of Asia. And I think we should reconsider their status in the light of new and emerging evidence, and completely reject the supposed thesis of an Aryan invasion. A way to decenter the classical canon is by researching, studying, and teaching other ancient cultures, including Vedic India. Here I want to stress that this is just one example I gave you. So you could also be studying ancient Iran. You could also be studying ancient China, as many people are now doing, especially when it comes to Chinese empires, Roman Empire, but also with Greece, comparing China with Greece. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in an Indo-European framework, but the Indo-European framework itself does not necessarily need to completely disappear either. The Rig Veda I chose because I think it's a particularly rich and rewarding set of texts, composed before Homer and Hesiod, and much more faithfully preserved, and has a whole range of things to offer when it comes to studying also Greek and Roman sources and the relationship between human and non-human animals. I think the Vedic evidence for interdependence, or a kind of connection between human and non-human animals is much stronger and much more interesting in some cases than the things we get in Greece and Rome, and can help us actually to think with the phenomena such as the rituals of Greece and Rome. I would conclude with a citation. I would finish with a citation from Salvatore Settis, from his book on the concept of the classical. We have to look to the classical not as our dead and unmerited inheritance, but as something profoundly remarkable and alien that needs to be recreated every day, and something that is a powerful incentive to understand otherness. Thank you.